One of the issues with writing tests is that how do you know the tests are correct and covering every possible permutation? One of the ways you can do this is generating something called a code coverage report. And this allows you to see which lines of code in the function you're testing have been run as part of the test process. I've given you a simple example of a function here that takes an array and a value and returns true or false depending on whether the value exists in the array. So we've got a function called array contains. So this function here, array contains, pass it the array 1, 3, 4 and the value 2. We're saying, is the value 2 in this array? Or is the value 3 in this array? So this top version, when we ask is 2 in the array, should return false. And the bottom call to the function should return true because we're asking is 3 in the array. And this code works by firstly setting the found variable to false. So we assume that it's not in the array and then loops through every value in the array. And if the current index, so if index 0 is equal to the value we're looking for, it sets found to true, then moves on to the next element in the array and says if index 1 in the array is the one we're looking for, set found to true, and so on. So it does this for each line. And so it loops through each element in the array, and if one of those elements is the one we're looking for, then it returns true. Otherwise, the found variable will still be false. It will never run this line, and we'll get a true or false depending on whether the value exists in the array or not. Now in this example, I've given you a working function. Previously, I've given you functions with bugs in them so I can demonstrate how testing works. In this case, the function works as intended and we're not going to change the code. What I want to stress now is how to generate a coverage report and show you how you can see if the code's been tested or not. Let's create a test class for this function. And for now, we won't put any tests in it because I want to show you that you can generate a code coverage report that demonstrates that no lines of code in the function have been run. And to do this, you first of all need to add the file that you want to include in the coverage report to your PHP unit configuration file. So that's the PHP unit.xml file we created previously, and you just need to add this block to it. It's a filter block which enables you to add things to a whitelist of files that are included in the coverage report. Assuming we've got the array contains.php in a folder called includes, it doesn't matter about the folder name or file name, but that could be in a folder called includes / array contains.php. We're including this file in the coverage report, and that would just be the path to the file relative to the PHP unit.xml. So if we were including database table.php, for example, we'd have CSY2028 / database table.php. You can also include directories. So here I've got file as opening and closing tags. You can also have directories there, including an entire directory in your whitelist. But once you've done that, that file or folder is then included in your code coverage report, and you can then generate a report which tells you which lines of code from each of those files in the report have been run as part of the testing process. You then need to get PHP Unit to generate a code coverage report, and it won't do this automatically. You need to tell it what type of report to generate, and I recommend using HTML because it's a lot easier to look at. And you can tell it to generate an HTML report by running the PHP unit command like this. So PHP unit -- coverage -HTML equals, and then a folder that you want it to write the report into. And /report tells it to create a folder called report in the current directory and write the code coverage report to that folder. If you were running this command from the jokes folder, it would create a report folder in the jokes folder, and your coverage report would then be inside that folder. And once you've run this, you can then look at the index.html that it's created in your browser, and it will show you something like this. So this is the code coverage report, and you can see it lists the file that we included in the whitelist, and any files listed in the whitelist would appear in this list. So if you've got more than one file in there, it'll appear in this list. And it tells you the number of lines that have been executed during the test. Now, because our test isn't doing anything, we've got 0.00% of lines from this file having been run as part of the test. So that means we need to add some tests for it. You can click on the name of the file to view information about that file in particular. It shows you the code from the file in addition to which lines have been executed and which ones haven't. The ones in red or pink here are lines that haven't yet been run as part of your testing process. If you've got white space, they'll be white. They won't appear in the test because you can't actually execute a line that's white space. That just kind of gets ignored. And also the function lines, it won't show that unless you've executed the lines inside it. But we can see that during our test, none of these lines have been executed. To remedy that, we'll write a test to test that the code works. So I've written one test in here. This starts with the array 135 and then runs the function and says, is the number 4 in the array? And we're saying that we're expecting the result to be false if the function is working correctly. So if the function is working correctly, the result should be false given these two inputs. So given this array and the number 4, we're asking, does the array contain the number 4? It doesn't. So result should be false, and that's why we're using assert false. If we then run the tests again and generate the coverage report again, we can now see that 71% of the lines in the file have been executed, and they are marked in green. So we can see that those lines have actually been run as part of the test. But obviously, we've still got a couple of red lines here that have never been run. And it's worth thinking about why that is, because our test at the moment is testing that the function's working correctly, but it's only testing one path through the file. If you've got an array and the value is not inside it, this if statement will never evaluate to true, and it will never run any code between this brace and this brace. And that's why the coverage report is useful, because it lets you check to see if there's any test that you might be missing. If you've got a long function with, say, 10 or 20 different levels of nesting, which is unreasonable in most cases, but you might have that, you don't necessarily know if every single path through the function has been tested correctly. And the code coverage report allows you to work that out, because you can look at this code coverage report and see, one of my tests is missing, or at least one of my tests is missing, because I'm not accounting for what happens when this if statement evaluates true. So your next job is to write a test that triggers that if statement so you can test that the code inside here is working correctly. And that's what I've done here. I've written a second test. I've called it test does contain. I've said, is the number 5 in this array? In this case, it should trigger that if statement, and I should get a 100% code coverage. So if I now run the code, I can see that my tests have now run every single line in the file. And that's what we want. If we can see that every single line of code is being triggered as part of the tests, then we know that the function is being thoroughly tested. And in principle, it's working correctly. 100% code coverage doesn't always mean that every possible test is run, because there can be things that avoid it. But 100% code coverage is a good starting point for having robust and thorough tests.